Good to go.
So, are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Honestly, I can't believe that you're all here. I really appreciate, thank you to Sherry and the Derry Library. As I mentioned, this is sort of a second hometown. It's really a thrill for Janelle and I to be here today and chat with you all about hiking and about mentorship and about girl power and empowerment on this crazy snowy day. I'm going to take my time with this, and if you all have anywhere to go or you need to leave early and you want something signed, just let me know. As I mentioned, for those of you who bought a book already, afterwards we'll sign them for you. For those of you who have not bought a book but want to, we're going to stick around afterwards until everybody is happy and taken care of, because I really appreciate you being here. And like Sherry said, where else are we going to go this afternoon? So, how many of you are hikers? Consider yourself hikers. How many of you have hiked? How many of you know what the 52 with a view is? Like 3 of you. All right, we're going to talk about that. I know you know.
I saw it on your
What's that?
website.
On the website? Yeah. So my name is Dan Sesney. I'm the associate publisher of the Hippo. In between November 2011 and November 2012, Janelle and I hiked 225 miles over the course of 1 year and 6 days. We would have done it in a year if it wasn't for Hurricane Sandy, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. And we hiked a list called the 52 with a View. The 52 with a View is a mountain list. Am I loud enough? Am I good? Okay. The 52 with a View is a mountain list developed by a group of hikers in Sandwich, New Hampshire. They're called the Over the Hill Hikers. The list is designed to be a supplement to the 48 4,000 footers. The 48 4,000 footers are the 48 tallest peaks in New Hampshire. The 52 with a View is a supplement to that list. 52 plus 48 equals 100. The reason that this list exists is because many of the 4,000 footers, you work really hard to get there and there's no views from the top or anywhere on the mountain. So the 52 with the View is exactly what it says. It's a list of 52 mountains between about 2,500 feet, which is Mount Hedgehog, and just under 4,000 feet, which is Sandwich Dome, up in Waterville Valley. But somewhere on these hikes, somewhere on these mountains, either on the ledges or at the summit, or in one case at the trailhead, there's a spectacular vista. There's a beautiful view. So these are 52 mountains with a payoff. Now, it was developed by the Over the Hill Hikers as a family-friendly or senior hiking list, which is part of the reason why Janelle and I decided to tackle this list. What we very quickly found out was that a lot of these mountains are as difficult, if not more difficult, as the 4,000 footers. So this is a very hardcore group of seniors up in Sandwich Mountain that developed this list. Some of them are very kid-friendly, that basically anyone can do, families can do, and some of them are not. And we'll talk about that when we get to the slideshow a little bit. So let me tell you what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you a very quick reading from the book that sort of explains mine and Janelle's relationship and how we came to know each other and how we set off on doing this crazy journey. Then Janelle will bring Janelle up and she's going to give you the story about where we got our trail names. And then we'll do the slideshow. The slideshow is about 17, 20 minutes long, depending on how often I stop it or whatever questions that you have in the middle of it. And then afterwards we'll do a Q&A and we'll hang around for as long as we want. Before we start everything, one of the things I'm always curious about is how you all found out that this was happening. Was it how many found out through the library? And how did the rest of you find out?
Newspaper.
The Facebook? The Hippo, right. Okay, yeah, we had a thing, and there was Facebook.
Derry Women's Writers Group, Margaret King.
Oh, right, Margaret King. Margaret was going to show up, but unfortunately she had to wait for some such thing. Oh, I love Margaret. Margaret actually is a member of my own writing group as well, and she kicks my butt whenever. The story actually that is in that book, she edited for me. And harshly, I might add. But she made it better, so that's a good thing. So good. I'm glad that you all found your way here. So let me do this. Let's begin with a very short reading from the introduction. I want to give you some sense. I want to set up our relationship for you. Janelle is not my daughter, although I sometimes feel like she is. And I want to set up our relationship for you, and then we'll go from there. So this is from the introduction. And the hike that I talk about in this introduction is that picture. So they were our neighbors, these two. Twins by birth, but worlds apart in temperament and interests, yet always together. We knew them slightly. The two kids who lived next door. The kids who got in my way when I tried to cut the lawn. The kids who went screaming down the alley out back in the summer. The kids who lived not with their parents, but with their grandparents, Sarah and Jim. In the spring of 2011, all our lives changed when Mina lost her job, and Jim, the twins' grandfather, passed away. We came together in a terrible burst of pain and confusion, two families adrift and looking for comfort. The twins suddenly began navigating toward us, and with Mina home that summer, I began to come home to a full house. Kids running around, helping in the garden, playing in the basement, coming with me as I took trips to the market or the movies. The twins adopted us, and we let them. But we had no experience in such matters, no warm-up to dealing with pre-tweens. They just were there. So we went on living and hiking, because that's what we did anyway. It seemed natural to simply take them along. The White Mountain National Forest is a 750,000-acre swath of timber, tourists, and trails in the northern part of our state. There are hundreds of mountains and an equal amount of trails, some as challenging and terrifying as anything the Rockies could throw into a hiker's path. So that's where we took them. That summer, it all began with a short hike up Bald Mountain, a small, family-friendly mountain in Franconia Notch State Park. We took the twins, along with my niece and nephew. The summit is open and there's plenty of rock for kids to scramble around on. After, on her own, Janelle asked me if we could do that again, hike again. I said, of course, but I would have to coordinate something with Mina and the rest of the kids. Looking back on that day, I still remember very clearly how she responded. She said, "That's okay, you can just take me."
I don't remember.
I know you don't remember. I know you don't remember, but I remember.
I want to hike with Ian and Meg, but not my brother. He's too annoying.
Her story changes, as she gets older. Pretty soon she's going to be denying everything. That's called being a teenager. I should have known then that there was something special happening. So, and there was. So Janelle and I started hiking. My wife and I had just come back from, you saw this in Nepal's slideshow, we had just come back from Nepal. We had spent a week in the Grand Canyon. We had hiked across North and South Dakota on the Centennial Trail. I thru-hiked England on the Coast to Coast walk. And when we got back from Nepal, we were freshly married, didn't have any kids of our own, and we were looking for the next notch in our belt, the next grand adventure in our belt. And little did we know that grand adventure was going to be, was at our doorstep in the form of two then 9-year-old twins. So she wanted to hike, and I went out and I asked some of my hiker friends who I knew had kids about that age. This 9-year-old is suddenly in my life. She wants to hike. I've never done that before. She has no gear. I don't know how to do that. How do I do it? What do I do? And most of the advice that I got back was, take her out on a hike or two and she'll get bored. Get it out of her system and she won't want to do it again. Well, it didn't turn out like that. But that was my initial strategy. So we started short in our city. We live in Manchester, so we went hiking in the parks. And I have a little story about one of our first hikes where someone called the police on us, which was a lot of fun. And I'll tell you that story at the end. And she was great, and she started getting more miles and miles on her feet. She started getting stronger. So we went up to the Unkanunuks up in Goffstown, and we hiked them, and she had a great time. Then we hiked Pack Monadnock, which is Monadnock's twin sister down in Temple, New Hampshire. I believe it's in Temple, New Hampshire. It's a 2,000-footer. That was her first 2,000-footer. And we hiked that sucker in a downpour. It was pouring rain, freezing rain. It was cold. She had no gear. We had to throw all of my wife's gear on her. And I thought that was it. I'm going to take her up there. She's going to hate this. And she's never going to want to hike again. Instead, exactly the opposite happened. We got down to the bottom of the mountain, and she asked me, "Dan, when are we going to hike a real mountain?" And by real mountain, what she meant was a 4,000-footer, because she knew that that's what myself and my wife hiked. So she wanted to hike that. So my goal changed then. I decided, why not? I'll train her to get up a 4,000-footer. We'll do a few more hikes. We'll get her trail legs under her. And then maybe we'll do a low 4,000 footer. We'll do a Tecumseh or a Wambeck or something like that, because that's what she wants to do. So in order to get there, we started climbing a little higher mountains with a little bit more distance to them. Our first 52 with a view mountain was Mount Kearsarge up in Warner. A very popular mountain. We hiked it on a freezing cold November day, November 5th, 2011. It was freezing cold, the roads were closed, but it was clear. And we got up to the top and we were able to spend at least an hour at the top exploring the old forester's cabin up there, and she loved it. We threw snowballs at the summit, which was a lot of fun. Afterwards, we hiked a mountain in Waterville Valley called Welsh Dickey, a very popular tourist mountain. It's a double peak in Welsh Dickey. If none of you have hiked this mountain before, I would suggest it for either a first-time hike or taking a tourist or a visitor up there. It's not a lot of elevation gain, and the views are spectacular for very little work. We saw mountain bikes up at the summit. This was in November, mountain bikes up at the summit with the big fat spiked wheels. So then came Mount Monadnock. In March of 2012, we hiked Mount Monadnock. And that pretty much sealed the deal for her. Mount Monadnock has had, how many of you hiked Mount Monadnock? I know, you're curious. And as you know, Mount Monadnock is very open at the top, and the views are forever. And in March of 2012, there was a weekend, I don't know if you guys remember this, where the temperatures were ridiculously hot. They got up into the 70s and the 80s in March of 2012. It was 71 degrees at the summit of Mount Monadnock in the middle of March when we hiked that mountain. And there's a picture of it up here. Afterwards, on the way home, so now we had hiked 352 with the view mountains. Even though that wasn't my intent, I was just getting her a little higher and higher each time. So on the way home, we had a conversation about mountain lists. And we talked about the 4,000 footers, and the 4,000 footers in winter, and the trail rides list, and all these other mountain lists that exist in New Hampshire. And I said, oh, and it just so happens that we just hiked a third mountain on this kind of obscure list called the 52 with the View. And of course, Janelle, once again, drove this whole journey of ours by saying, well, why don't we just hike that list then? So that's what we did. We set out to do in 1 year's time, which meant between March of 2012 and November of 2012, which is what, about 6 months, 8 months, we had 48 mountains to hike. So a friend of mine always points out that for those 8 months, it was like we were running for office. It was like we were engaged in a political campaign, because we had to sit down. We got her family together, we got my family together, we sat down at a table with a calendar, and I had a red marker and a black marker. And the red marker were all the days that we could hike between now and November. The black marker were all the days we couldn't. And I didn't want to take her out of school, and I couldn't leave my job. So we ended up with 49 mountains to hike, and about 65, 67 days to do it in total. And like I said, we would have done it if it wasn't for Hurricane Sandy. And we'll talk a little bit about Hurricane Sandy a little bit later. And it ended up, we ended up doing it 1 year and 6 days. So before I keep going, I'm going to bring Janelle up, and Janelle is going to tell you guys how we got our trail names, because that's a very important part of our story. Right? Yeah.
So Dan got his trail name because him and his wife Mina were hiking in Wind Cave National Park, and they could hear a herd of buffalo coming. So Dan ran out of the way and hid behind a tree.
True.
But it was only 2 baby buffalo that were I got my trail name because my brother's not a very big hiker, but he was hiking with us. I believe it was on Welsh Dickey, probably.
Yeah, I think so. Or one of the others.
Yeah, or the Ogunnu mixed in Goffstown. And he said, oh, you think you're such a tough cookie.
Second, what are the rules of trail names?
You cannot give yourself your own trail name. Somebody else has to give it to you.
Yes. So we both got our trail names ironically, which is great. So that's how we got our trail names, right? Thanks, Janelle. So Janelle and I started hiking, and I had no idea how to do this. You know, all that advice that I got from my friends who hiked with their kids turned out not to be the case. With every hike, Janelle just got stronger and more determined to hike and wanted to go longer distances. And after a while, it really simply became for us, anyway, and you can, I don't want to speak for her, but for me, it became a way for me to get to know her. It became a way for us to bond. And I know that it's very flip to simply say, oh, well, we just spent 225 miles hiking with a 10-year-old and we bonded. Because when you are, what I learned is that when you are with a 9 or a 10-year-old who is not your 9 or 10-year-old for 4 or 5 or 6 days in a row together, working on one project, you do way more than bond together. It becomes a friendship, but it becomes something a lot more, something a lot closer. And she's almost a teenager now, so I hope that she feels the same way, but I don't know if she does or not. But I know that I learned a lot on this journey that went well beyond simply hiking or being out in the outdoors. During our first hike on Mount Kearsarge, and we'll start the slideshow, I'll tell you a quick story about what I mean by what I learned. When Mina and I are on the trail, or it got to the point where I was on the trail, where I would often, what was important to me was mileage, getting to the top, moving as fast as I could. And what happens when you do that is that you lose sight of the reason why you're there, which is what I call micro-hiking. And with Janelle, I had to stop, and I had to slow down, and I had to hike on her level. And to some of my hiking friends, this was torture. They didn't want to do that. Studying every leaf and every branch and every frog and newt and slug that came along the way. But I soon grew to really enjoy that part of hiking and do it now, even when I'm not hiking with her. So on Mount Kearsarge, Janelle, we live in Manchester, west side of Manchester. Our backyard is an alley. So Janelle had no natural experience, or very little natural experience. And on Mount Kearsarge, on the way up, I let her lead. And I often let her lead, especially on the way up, because I figure, number one, I can keep her always in my line of sight. But number two, if she slips and falls, I have a better chance of catching her if she's behind me. So I often let her lead. And she stopped on the trail. And the Winslow Trail on Mount Kearsarge, to me, is like a super highway. There is no question of the trail. But to her, it was simply being in the woods. So she turned and she said, I don't know where to go. I don't know where the trail is. And it occurred to me that we are starting at such a basic level, her and I, that I had to teach her about blazes. I had to teach her the difference between the trail and the woods, the forest. And so I make all these assumptions. I made all these assumptions as a hiker about what it is to be a hiker and how you hike. And I had to start from zero, and maybe even less than zero, right? I had to teach her. We sat down in the trail that day, and I went up and I showed her the blazes and had her touch the blazes and taught her about trails versus woods, which is the most basic part of hiking, right? You're following the trail, especially in New Hampshire. So that's what I call micro-hiking, and that happened over and over and over again in our year, until maybe about the halfway point, probably after 20 or 30 mountains, she started leading me. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So what I want to do is, if you have any real quick questions before we start the slideshow, and we'll start the slideshow. It'll be about 17. I'll actually narrate the slideshow as we go. There's a couple of times that I'll probably want to stop. But actually, let's start with this one. This is, like I said, this is Aaron, Ian, and Meg, my niece and nephew. I want to start this. I always start my show with this picture. And at the very end of the slideshow, I have an exact duplicate of the picture of the 4 kids taken exactly 2 years later. I call it my sunrise sunset shot because they look so different naturally after 2 years. But what I want to do is go to the next one before we actually start. This was at the top of South Oak. This is the first time Janelle and I hiked together alone. This was her first summit with just me and her at the top of Mount Okonook. And a word about, you had your North Face then. Yeah. Jeans and the old boots. We had no gear for her. And I didn't know what having gear for a 9 or 10-year-old even meant at that time. We went into all the stores, the EMSs and the REIs. I remember a trip that we took to EMS where I walked in with her and I said, I need to get her a day pack. And the clerk said, for what? And I said, for hiking. And And he said, well, for hiking what? And I said, White Mountains, we're going to the White Mountains, we're going to hike the White Mountains. And he said, oh, we don't have anything like that for her. Just like that. We don't have anything like that for her. So getting gear for her was a trial. And I have a wonderful story about how we finally managed to do that. Maybe you can tell the story today about how we managed to do that in Bethlehem. And we'll talk about a bit about